Okay, it seems everything works fine. Welcome again to Warsaw University Tuesday astronomical series of seminars, or wherever I lost the order of words. So welcome to our next seminar. And today we have Professor David Heyrovsky from Charles University. David is a long-term collaborator of ours, and we've known each other for like 20 years working on microlensing. David did his master's in Charles University and did his PhD at Harvard, and now is a professor at Charles University in Prague, and is going to tell us about triple lenses and how to find exoplanets and exomoons with microlensing. David, please.
Thank you very much, Łukasz. Thank you for the invitation and for the nice introduction. And thank you all for coming or connecting. I would like to tell you something about our research, which we did mainly with Kamil Daněk, my former PhD student, on three-body lensing. So as this image in the background suggests, it has something to do with what happens if the light from a background source, like a distant star, en route to the observer passes through the gravitational field of a three-body system. And obviously, one of the implications is that you could, in this way, detect possibly even exomoons, but that's only one of the possible regimes of the three-body lens. So to start, let's see. Okay. Łukasz asked me to give a brief introduction to microlensing. So it is slightly embarrassing, of course, to give an introduction to microlensing to Warsaw Observatory, because that's like bringing owls to Athens. So I hope you like owls. And I will briefly start with what is gravitational microlensing by a single lens, what is gravitational microlensing by two-body systems, typically binary stars or stars with planets. And then we will get to three-body microlensing. I shall discuss some of the observed events, some of the properties, and then we shall go to study what are the different lens regimes for several simple lens models before we go on to something more general, and we shall show how to map the lens regimes for three bodies in an arbitrary spatial configuration. So we can map all the from close to wide and all different regimes in between. Of course, if we speak about arbitrary configurations, so three-body lenses, in general, when you have lensing even with single planets, so you have to take care of orbital motion. So in three-body systems, this will be even more important. So we shall see how we can visualize this and see what are the changes occurring during orbital motion, which will bring us closer to one of the words in the title, and that is exomoons. And we shall discuss briefly the exomoon detectability and prospects for the near future. Let me start with the basic principle of what is a gravitational lens. And here it comes in handy that last week you had a seminar by Jerry Gilmore, who told you about Einstein's formula for the light deflection and its first experimental verification. This regime which I have here is nearly identical, and the only difference is that you are observing a distant object like a star, could be a galaxy or a quasar also. And the massive object which is along the line of sight is not the sun, but it's some other astrophysical object. And in the regime of microlensing, we will have the source will be a star in our galaxy, typically a star in the galactic bulge. And the massive object in between, which acts as a lens, will be another star or a stellar system. And of course, due to the action of the gravitational field of this lens, we do not see the ray coming, as it would in flat space directly to us, but we see another ray which gets bent to us in the gravitational field of the lens. So for us, the star appears to be at a different position. And what you want to do is you want to put a relation between the true position of the source, which is denoted by this angle beta, and the position of the image where you see it, which is this angle theta. And that's fairly simple because you can do it from this triangle at back. You just write that this length is this longer length minus this small length. And if you divide it by the distance to the source star, so you get something that is called the lens equation. So the position of the source is the position of the image minus the deflection angle, this alpha, multiplied by this ratio of distances. It's simple, and the whole thing depends on what you plug in for the deflection angle. For a single star, you can always use the formula for the point mass lens, and you can use it also for any spherically symmetric gravitational field outside the mass distribution. And this is the formula which, in fact, Einstein came up with. And if it doesn't look familiar, so all you need to do is you see that this dl times the angle theta is the impact parameter, is the distance of closest approach of the ray. So this is what you saw already last week. If you plug in this formula to the lens equation, you get this simpler form where all the constants, all the distances and masses and constants come together into one parameter, which we call the Einstein radius, which is this square root of this ratio. And you can see there is the combination of the distances, and it's proportional to the square root of the mass of the lens. And the equation which you have here is actually very simple because it's nothing but a quadratic equation. And so you can solve it, and you can get, for a general non-zero displacement of the background source, you get two solutions. And how can you get two solutions? Well, obviously, you can see this ray, but you can also send a light ray on the opposite side of the lens, which will go closer and can be bent more. And so in principle, the observer should see two images. This is something you don't see in the case of the sun because the disk of the sun, the angular size is large, so the second image is hidden. But if you would put the sun sufficiently far away, so you would see even the second image. And of course, there is a special degenerate case when you put the source star exactly behind the lens. And in that case, you would see a ring with the radius of this Einstein radius. Let's take a look at what this would look like in the sky. So in the sky, you would see, well, here would be the lensing object. This would be, let's say, the true position of the source, but you don't see it. And instead of it, you see two images. You see one image here outside this Einstein ring and one image inside. And in principle, if this source star would move further away from the lens, so if it goes further away, so the true source position eventually will merge with this outer image, and this inner image will disappear in the lens. On the other hand, if you go with the source closer and closer to the lens, or behind the lens, in fact, so this image stays outside, but it approaches the Einstein radius. This image stays inside, approaching the Einstein radius, until if you put it exactly behind, you would see the whole Einstein radius slit. Now, what is, of course, interesting to see is that the scale of the event is given by, or of this, imaging is given by the Einstein radius. And if you take two stars in our galaxy, like one in the galactic bulge and another, let's say, solar mass star somewhere halfway between, you will see that this Einstein radius is on the order of 1 milliarcsecond, which is tiny. So unfortunately, you cannot resolve these two images. So you would see them just combined as one image. So the question is, how can we observe such a thing? And to do that, we take one step sideways first. And let's consider that the source is not a simple point source of light, because even a star, a distant star, you can model it by a tiny disk rather than by an exact point. And if I make a huge disk here for the background star, so each point on the surface of the star can be imaged as I did previously. So this point will have one image outside, one inside. The central point will have one image here, one inside, and so on until you construct a large image here and a large image here. And here you can see again easier if you move the star away from the lens. So this image will then, the deformation will disappear, and it will be really what the source looks like. And this image disappears at the lens. And when you go closer and closer, so this banana-shaped image will extend further out along the Einstein radius, and this one will also extend from inside until these images will join, and you would see a real Einstein ring image if you have it exactly behind the lens. Now, the reason I'm showing this is the following. What you can see already from here is that the images, the total area of the images is larger than the original area of the source, which means you will be getting more photons when the source is lensed, which means the flux from the source star will be amplified by the lens. You can compute this amplification, and you can compute it for what we call a point source, which means infinitesimally small source. And there it's really just given by the ratio of the solid angles subtended by the images to the solid angles subtended by the source. And if you look at this, so the ratio of these solid angles is nothing but the Jacobian of the transformation from the image coordinates to the source coordinates, Or what is easier to compute, it's 1 over the Jacobian of the lens equation. So you just compute the derivatives of the lens equation, take the determinant, put it to the minus first power, sum it over all the images, and you will get how many times more photons or how many times larger flux you would see. Before I go further, so it's good to say, of course, you can have special points where this Jacobian will be equal to 0. And in that case, you would get infinite amplification. And that happens for special point sources. And this happens for point sources which are located on something that you call the caustic of the lens. And the images will appear on something that is called the critical curve of the lens. In this special case of a single lens, the caustic is the single point exactly behind the lens, and the image is exactly the Einstein ring. So that's in this particular case. We will see in more complicated lenses that both of these, even the caustic, even the critical curve, will be curves with special properties. But let's go further. For the point lens, you can actually compute this analytically. So the source flux amplification by a single lens is given by this simple formula, which depends only on the angular displacement of the source, background source from the lens. And this is a simply decreasing function of this beta, of this displacement. So if beta is large, this goes to 1. So there is, you get 1 times the original flux. But if beta goes to 0, this thing gets larger and larger. And if beta is exactly 0, it would diverge. If you have a lens moving in front of a background source, and if you approximate the trajectory by a straight line, which is usually enough, so of course this displacement depends on time, and you can write it as this function where u0 is the impact parameter, t0 is the peak time, and t is the Einstein radius crossing time. So once you put this in, so you can compute what does the light curve look like, and this is what you get. This is an animation by Scott Gowdy. So in the top, what you have the lens star here in the foreground, and the source is the small red circle which passes in the background. The 2 blue things are the images that you would see if you could resolve it, but you can't see that, it's too small. Instead, you see this amplification of the source flux, which is given by this light curve below here. So it's just the sum of the sizes of the images divided by the size of the source. And in this particular case, you can get 5 times higher flux from the background star. And of course, the key is what is the time scale of this? And for stars in our galaxy, in bulge stars and some intermediate lens stars, you typically get a time scale of weeks to months. So this is in principle observable. So you can detect microlensing by observing the temporary brightening of the background source star, which is exactly given by this shape. This was something which started, of course, the microlensing monitoring projects in the early 1990s, and the initial surveys like Macho and Eros are not operating anymore, but Ogle, of course, is operating, of course, now with a pause because of COVID. MOA, these are still functioning, and the idea is you observe a rich star field, like star towards the bulge, and if between you and the bulge there is something, passing between you and the star, you will see its brightening. And of course, you'll see many variable stars. You can sort them out. And this is just an image from one of the early years, 1995. These are the light curves of events observed by the Macho project. So you can see that they detected many events. And over the years since then, I think the number of detected microlensing events is somewhere close to 20,000 or so. So it's, it's a rich trove of data. And of course, the light curves of single lens events are simple, but what is more interesting is if you can see something more complicated. And because the majority of stars are components of multiple systems, so many of them will be binary stars, and also many stars harbor planets, probably a majority of them. So in principle, you should be able to see events where not only one star, but 2 stars or a star and a planet both deflect the light at the same time. In this case, you have to then model the deflection angle by just a sum of deflection factors from the 2 bodies. So you have, let's say you have one component at a position theta A in the sky, the other at a position theta B, and their fractional masses mu A, mu B, with m being the total mass. Again, there are too many letters here, so when you put this into the lens equation, so you typically rescale the angles by the Einstein radius of the total mass, and then you get a simpler equation where y is the source position in Einstein radius units, x is the image position in Einstein radius units, and you have this simpler equation. It is simpler, but still it's much more complicated than for the simple lens. So it's a vector equation. So you have, in fact, two equations. And it turns out that to solve this equation and to work with it, it's very useful to switch to complex notation. So you take the sky as the complex plane, you take one of these coordinates as the real component and the other as the imaginary component. So you can write the source position as a complex number, the image position as a complex number z, and of course the two lens component positions. And then you can write the lens equation. You just transform it into this form, which turns out to be feasible, very feasible for computations. Before we go further, so it's good to point out that for this two-point mass lens, there are in fact two main parameters which determine the regimes of lensing. One of them is the mass ratio of the two bodies, and the second is the projected separation of the two bodies. Here, of course, in units of Einstein radius. If you look at this lens equation in this form, so it can be converted, you can convert this to a polynomial equation, and it turns out this equation has, for a given source position, if you want to solve for the image position, it can have either 3 or 5 images. And here is a simulation of one simple lens where you have two equal mass objects. One is located, let's see, here is one is located here, the other one is located here. And the green thing is the critical curve of this combination. The red thing is the caustic of this combination. And now this thing, what is happening here is that this black circle which runs here is a source which passes in the background. And these blue things are the images formed by the lens. And here down is the light curve that you're observing. So if you stare for a while, so you can see that when the source is outside the caustic, you have 3 images. Once it enters the caustic, you have 5 images, and once it exits, you have 3 images again. And the images, whenever the source crosses the caustic, appear on the critical curve and disappear on the critical curve. This is accompanied in the light curve by these huge spikes in amplification. So something which, the shapes of the light curves are dramatically different, but, again, it's something which is fairly simple to describe what's going on. Such events, of course, many such events have been observed. This is one of the early events. This is Metro event 98 SMC1. So this is an image with a source star in the small imaginary cloud. And here you have a binary lens. This is the track of the source, and it crossed the caustic of the lens, this part of the caustic. And you can see there are spikes here and another bump. And these are light curves from 2 observatories and in 2 different spectral bands. In this case, you can see that the critical curve looks different. There it was 1 curve. Here it has 3 different loops, and the caustic has also 3 different loops here. So the question is, what are the possible geometries or topologies of the critical curve and caustic? And this is something which is fairly simple to show. You can show that the two-body lens has 3 regimes. So this is the first one which I showed. So the critical curve can be a single curve. In the previous slide, we saw that it can be also 1 curve with 2 loops inside, but it can be also 2 separate loops. And you can simply visualize this. So this is sort of the intermediate regime. This is the closed regime, and this is the wide regime. So if you have the intermediate regime, and if you put the lenses further apart, so of course, eventually, the critical curve splits. And if you move them further apart, so you have just 2 Einstein rings of simple lenses. And on the other hand, if you put the lenses closer together, so the curve merges, these 2 small loops appear inside, but the outer curve gradually transforms into the Einstein ring of a single lens with the total lens mass, and these 2 small loops shrink and disappear at the origin. If you look at the caustics, so you can compute the caustics, there are the blue curves here, and here we have them plotted in something that is called the amplification map. So we computed the point source amplification by summing the inverse Jacobians of all the images. And the dark color is strong amplification, pale color is weak amplification, and the contours are also amplification contours. So you can see that in the intermediate regime, you have this 6 cusps on the caustic, but if you spread the lenses far apart, so the caustic splits here, and you get 2 loops with 4 cusps each. And on the other hand, if you put them closer together, so the caustic splits here, and you get 1 with 4 cusps and 2 with 3 cusps. if you look at the structure along the caustic, so you can see that close to the cusps of the caustic, these pointed areas, so you have strong amplification even outside. But in between, along these parts, which are called the folds, there is, very weak amplification, and then it jumps abruptly to strong amplification inside, as we saw in the previous slide curves. To find these regimes, of course, what is sufficient is to find the intermediate, the transition regimes, or the boundaries between the regimes. And obviously this is given in this case by, putting the equal masses at 2 Einstein radius apart. So then exactly it's the point when these two loops connect, or when you put them closer to 2 to the minus 1/2. So you have exactly the case just before these two loops separate inside. And of course, you can do this for different mass ratios. So here, this was the equal mass case. Here it is, 1/3 mass ratio, 1/9 mass ratio. And you see that independent of the mass ratio, you get the same types of here caustics and critical curves. But the only thing that differs is that you have the whole thing deformed away from the lower mass object. And of course, what is interesting is if you go down in the mass ratios, so you go towards the regime of planets. So if you have very small mass ratios, so you'll have regimes corresponding to, 1 star and 1 extremely low mass object, which is something which is, of course, observationally interesting to find. Before we get to that, so here's just a plot saying, look, these are the parameters of the 2-point mass lens. Here is the fractional mass of one of the bodies, and here's the separation. And independent of the fractional mass, you always have the 3 regimes, and just the boundaries shift depending on the fractional mass. So the equal mass case is here in between, where you have the close intermediate boundary and the intermediate wide boundary. But if you go to lower mass lenses, lower mass companions, so these boundaries all shrink towards the Einstein radius of the star itself. So if you want to look for planetary mass lenses, the ideal place to look at is if they are positioned close to the Einstein ring of its host star. The first planet which was detected by Microlensing was detected in 2003, this case Ogle 2003, bulge 235. And you can see the basic light curve here, quite noisy still, but observed by Ogle and Moa. So the basic light curve looks very much like a single point lens Microlensing light curve. But there is this feature which cannot be explained by it, and this is due to a planet around the lens. And the mass of the planet is about 1.5 Jupiter masses, and its separation is 3 astronomical units, so fairly large from the planet. And you can look at this animation also by Scott Gaudy of what is going on and what you would see if you could resolve this. So this red thing is the caustic of the system. Here there is the star. Here there is a planet which is close to the green critical curve. And this little blue thing is the background source which crosses the caustic. And as it crosses the caustic, you can see here in the detail, so there are 2 additional purple images appear, and as it crosses out, 2 images disappear. And this is accompanied by this feature on the light curve, which you can see and identify what's going on. What is even more interesting about microlensing is that it is sensitive to low mass planets, and sort of one of the first famous low mass exoplanets detected by microlensing is this case Ogle 2005 bulge 390, in which case the mass ratio was about 8 times 10 to the minus 5. So the lens, the companion to the lens star was about 5 Earth masses at a separation of about 2.6 astronomical units from its host star. And this is a very peculiar case. So this small feature is caused by the planet. Fortunately, it was observed by multiple observatories, so it was confirmed independently. And this is a case when the planet is not close to the Einstein radius, but it's far away. But the source star happened to cross this small caustic, diamond-shaped caustic of the planet, which caused this extra bump on the light curve. As I mentioned in the abstract, so today we have already about 130 planets detected by microlensing. This figure, I may put this figure together last August, so there are only 112 planets. But it's interesting to look at the scatter plot of what is the distribution of the detected planets by semi-major axis and by mass. And these are logarithmic mixed scales. This is mass in Jupiter masses. So here is 1 Jupiter mass. And this is semi-major axis in astronomical units. So here is 1 astronomical unit. The black dots are our solar system planets. So this is the Earth, and this is Jupiter. And you can see that microlensing is primarily sensitive to planets which are a few astronomical units from their host star. So unlike other methods, it's not sensitive to those which are very close in or very far out, but it's really sort of in the regime where you would expect planets in a solar system-like system. And also, you can see that it's sensitive to very low masses. The one which I showed previously, this 2005 Bulge 390. So that's here, and you can see that now there are detected planets which have only, practically Earth mass, really, and really practically astronomical unit from its host star. To compare this with all the other detected exoplanets, which as of last August, it was about 4,500. Now it's just past 5,000. So the green dots are planets detected by transits, red are by radial velocity, and the third most numerous are the microlensing planets here. So you can still see that although there's a large overlap in the parameters here, you really get close to Earth mass planets at astronomical units by microlensing. And there are planned projects which would observe microlensing from space with the Roman Space Telescope, for example, and these would push the detectability down so that you could be able to detect not only Earths, but also Venuses and Marses at around other stars. So this is sort of the unique niche for microlensing. Within these planets already, we are coming to the topic of my talk, which is Threebody lensing. There are already several systems in which the lens is composed of a star with two planets. And this was the first one, Ogle 2006 Bulge 109. And you can see the general structure of the caustic can be described by a two-point mass lens. The light curve is very complicated, but there are these, 5 specific features. And 4 of them, except this feature number 4, can be explained by a two-point mass lens, just by a single planet. But there is an extra peak, which is fairly prominent, which cannot be explained by, whatever you do, even though you include orbital motion, as you can see here, which leads to a slight deformation of the caustic. You cannot explain it, and you need to add another body to explain this feature close to this peak, which causes this prominent feature observed by multiple observatories. This system is also very interesting because it's an analog of a Sun, Jupiter, Saturn system. One of the lenses is a 0.7 Jupiter mass lens at 2.3 AU, and the other one is about a 0.3 Jupiter mass planet at about 4.6 AU. And taking into account that the main star, the host star, is about half a solar mass, so it's really very similar to the solar system, just rescaled to the lower mass of the star. By now, there are about 4 other systems, which are two-planet systems, but you have also other interesting systems. You have systems with three-body lenses, where you have a binary star with a planet in the binary. And this is one of the cases. It's Ogle 2016 Bulge 0613. And you can see the main light curve looks like a, mundane, one would say, binary star light curve with, a caustic entrance, a caustic exit. But if you look in more detail, so you can see that here there is a feature where you have an additional caustic entrance and an additional caustic exit. And this is something that can never happen in a two-point mass lens. You can never have 2 subsequent caustic entrances without a caustic exit in between. So this cannot be described by a two-point mass lens, and you need at least another point mass to describe the system. And in this case, it turns out there is a range. Of course, the parameter space is much more rich here, so it's much more difficult to search for what are the best fit solutions. And here in this paper by Han et al. 2017, so there are 6 of the solutions which can plausibly describe this system. All of them are binaries with a planet, so there are these 2 blue objects are the components of the binary, and the small blue object, the size sort of indicates the mass, is a planet in the binary. And you can see that here, these red shapes are the caustic shapes of the system. And you can see that the caustic shapes are really pretty diverse. And, you would need really better photometry to be able to discern between these. Or you could have subsequent photometry years later by some space telescope, let's say, where you can detect light from the lens. And you could determine which of these solutions is the more plausible than the others. At any rate, what is clear is that it is a planet in a binary. The other detected systems include also interesting cases such as a binary star with a circumbinary planet. So you have a binary star and a planet which orbits the binary. So again, another thing which can be detected by three-body lensing. In principle, if you look at more generally, so what could these three-body systems be? So we already mentioned a star with 2 planets, a binary star with a planet around 1 component, a binary star with a circumbinary planet. In principle, you could have also triple stars, or you can have a star with a planet with a moon. Maybe you could have also a star with a binary planet if such things exist. Maybe they do. The first 3 cases have already been detected. We know these systems, and surely the statistics will be growing now with more observed events. But what has not been detected yet, and what could be hopefully detected, are either triple stars or stars with a planet with a moon. For triple stars, though, this would have to be a very peculiar configuration, because for the event to be detectable as a triple lens event, you need all the 3 bodies to be separated by a few astronomical units from each other. If they are further than that, you would not see the effect of the further object on compared to the closer objects. So you would really have to have something like a close binary star with another companion, which just is projected to a distance that is closer than a few AU along the line of sight. So it's quite possible that a star plus planet plus moon system would be observed sooner than a triple star system. Whichever regime you are in, so what you need to describe the three-body lens, well, of course, you need 3 relative masses, so we can write them in units of the total mass. And of course, depending on the combination, you would be in different regimes. So for a triple star, all of them would be comparable. For a star with 2 planets, you would have 1 large and 2 small relative masses. For a binary star with a planet, you have 2 large and 1 small, etc. For a star with planet with a moon, you would have 1 large, 1 smaller, and 1 smallest fractional mass. 3 positions, of course, for the 3 bodies. For a static configuration, and we will use the complex description that we used already for the 2-point mass lens. And the lens equation is, you can just take the 2-point mass lens equation and add a 3rd term with the deflection due to the 3rd body. So it's very simple to write it. You can compute the lens Jacobian, which tells you what is the amplification and so on of images. And you get this simple formula, which in fact is the same like for a 2-body system, but again, you include a term from the 3rd body. It's enough to have this, and you can start, playing around. So you can take your combination of masses and positions. If you set the Jacobian equal to 0, you get the equation for the critical curve. Once you find the critical curve, you plug it in this equation, and you compute the lens Caustic, and you can see what are the geometries and configurations you get. Here there is a sampler of what you could get. And you can see that the diversity, this is by no means exhaustive, but you can see that the diversity of different topologies, geometries, and so on is very large. And what I'm showing here is not totally random configurations. If you take a look, so these crosses are the positions of the 3 bodies. And in each of these panels, you can see that they are in an equilateral triangle position, just with a different shape of the triangle. And there is only one other parameter that I change here, and that is the relative mass of one of the components. The other 2 are equal mass. So if you first look, let's say, at the critical curves, you can see that, well, it can be a single loop like here, or there can be 2 loops, which you can see here or here, 3 loops, 4 loops like here, or even 5 different loops. And of course, they can be in different configurations. So, quite a change from the 2-point mass lens. And if you look at the caustics, of course, the numbers of loops are the same as the numbers of loops of the critical curve, but you can see many other peculiar, you could say, pathological features or interesting features, depending on your inclination. Like here, for example, this caustic is a single loop, but it crosses itself. So you have points where the caustic has, self-intersections, something which does not happen in 2-point mass lensing. Here, in fact, these little things, these butterfly-like features, are also, self-intersections of these caustic loops. But you have other things here as well. For example, here in this case, you have one self-intersecting, complicated loop, and you have one three-cusp loop which is sitting over this. So you can have different parts of the caustic which intersect each other, sit one over the other, and again, things which you would never see in a two-point mass lens. Here you have a small three-cusped loop sitting inside this other thing. Here you have another small three-cusp loop inside. So it looks that the diversity is fairly huge. And if you go on, moving the parameters, you will see it's, it looks nearly hopeless. So you can do one thing, you can, shrug your shoulders and just go on to, use computer simulations to fit events, or you can try to see if you can find any method in this madness, if there is, if you can say in some way what are the different regimes, if you at least define them by the different shapes and topologies of the critical curve, let us say. And that's something which you can do. And what we did with Kamil Daněk is when we were looking, well, first we were playing around, but then we also started to look systematically on, how you can say what are the different regimes and when does one regime transform into another. And it turns out it's very useful to start from the lens Jacobian, which, first of all, identifies the critical curve, but it also tells you the amplification, in principle, parity of images and other things. And I shall illustrate the interesting properties for simplicity on the two-body lens Jacobian. So it has the same form, but you just sum two terms here instead of three terms for the triple lens. And of course, if you set this equal to 0, you get the critical curve. But let's look at what happens if we plot the contours of this Jacobian in the image plane, let's say in the plane of the lens. So of course, this is defined on the complex plane, but this is a real function. You can see the absolute value here. So you can just plot this. So what I'm plotting here is for relative masses. So the mass ratio is 4:1. So this is a 4 times more massive than this one. The bodies are separated by 1 Einstein radius. And this solid thick curve is the 0 Jacobian contour, which is the critical curve of this combination. And what is plotted here are the different contours of the Jacobian. So if you go inside here from 0, these are negative Jacobian contours. And if you go out, they are positive Jacobian contours. And now it's enough to look at this for a while. And then you start feeling, a sense of déjà vu or something that you are looking at something familiar. And indeed, if you go looking here into this negative Jacobian region closer to the lens positions, so you see that really here what you are seeing is something that looks like the shape of the critical curve in the wide binary configuration. And on the other hand, if you go outside towards the positive values, so you can see you start getting shapes if you go further out. So you have this, curve like this, but added to it, you have small two loops here. You start seeing the shapes of critical curves of what happens if you put the lenses close together. And you can see it even better if you plot this not as a contour plot, but if you plot this as a surface. So you take the complex plane and plot this Jacobian as, the Z component. So when you get close to the lenses, so you go down to negative values of the Jacobian. And when you go away from the lenses, so the Jacobian increases, but the maximum it can reach is 1, as you can see from here. And it reaches 1 at infinity when you are far away, or if you are at one of the maxima of the Jacobian. So there are these 2 points here. And now here, if you make horizontal sections, you exactly get gradually the different contours of the shapes of critical curves that you would get if you just move these points closer or further apart. And you can show that this is not just a coincidence, but that you can show it really mathematically directly from this formula, that the shape of the contour of, let's say Jacobian is some value lambda, is equal to the shape of the critical curve if you rescale the lens configuration by this factor. So if you go to negative values of the Jacobian, so you get the critical curves of the wider configuration. And if you go to the positive values, so you get critical curves of the configurations where you have the lenses closer together. So this looks kind of interesting for the 2-point mass lens, but we know everything about the 2-point mass lens. What's important is that all this is valid for the arbitrary number of bodies in the lens. So it's valid for triple lenses, quadruple lenses, and any other lenses. So this means you take a given shape of a configuration of, let's say, a triple lens, you look at all the different contours of the Jacobian for that configuration, and you immediately get all the different critical curves if you take these components and put them close together or far apart. And where do these geometries change? Well, that's visible already from here, and that's known for a long time. The contours, the geometry changes when the critical curve passes through a saddle point of the Jacobian. In the 2-point mass lens, there is one saddle point here, one saddle point here, and here. So you can see this is one of the critical combinations, which changes from the wide to the intermediate regime. And here, this shape is the contour when you are crossing from the intermediate to the close regime. So you can use these principles. I mean, it's again visible here better maybe in the 3-dimensional plot, but all these principles are valid for the Threebody lens. And this gives us a route to map the different regimes. So how do we do that in a triple lens or a Threebody lens parameter space? So we can choose some fixed masses, can be, a triple star, or, binary with a planet, or a star planet moon, or whatever you like. You fix the shape of a configuration. So you take, some shape of a triangle in the projected configuration, and you take some scale parameter, that means some size, or, let's say, the distance between two components or something like that, equal to 1. You compute the Jacobian saddle points. There is a simple polynomial formula to this. And for the Threebody lens, you can get up to 6 different saddle points. Of course, some of them can be degenerate, some of them can be equal, but maximum is 6. Once you find these saddle points, so you just look at what is the value of the Jacobian in these saddle points. And once you have these numbers, so you know that if you take the parameter and multiply it by this factor, 1 minus the Jacobian in the saddle point under the 4th root, so you'll exactly get at what values of the scale parameter, that means what separations or so on, will you transition from one regime to another. So like this, you can map what are the different lens regimes defined by different critical curve topologies. Then you take a different shape, repeat it, and once you do it for all shapes you like, you can take a different combination of masses and do the same. So let's illustrate this first on something very simple. So let's take some trivial configuration. So let's take 3 equal masses in a straight line. So we'll have one scale parameter which defines the separation of the two wider bodies, the bodies which are outside, and then you'll have one parameter E, which tells you, how far from the first body to the third body is the second body. So for 0, it would lie close to here. For 1, it would lie close to the next one. And you can do exactly what I described in the previous slide. And this is what you get. So here, or on the horizontal axis, you have this parameter which tells you if the third body is close to the first body, or it's close to the, in fact, this body number 3. And here you have the separation for close separation and wide separation. So you can see for any of these shapes, you get 1, 2, 3, you would get 4 boundaries here. So because of the symmetry, you do not get 6 different ones, but you get 4 here. Although we have special configurations like here in the middle, where you have only 2 different transitions, for example. And in principle, the parameter space here is divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different zones where you can take a sample from each of them, and this gives you the different critical curves and caustics that are accessible or possible for such lens configuration. You have something which is the close regime, that's this regime F, one outer loop with 4 small loops inside. You have something that is the wide regime, that is this regime C, where you have 3 separate loops. And then you have these different intermediate regimes which appear here. The regimes A and B are interesting because they are regimes close to one side or the other side here if you go up. And these are regimes where you can see that this is, let's say the regime B is, one distant lens plus an intermediate binary, one distant lens plus a closed regime binary. And of course, this one is one distant lens plus a wide regime binary. So you have these here. So you can go on, look at this and interpret the results here. So this looks fairly simple. So, let's try a different configuration. So let's try something which is not as a straight line. So let's try again 3 equal masses. And let's take, again, a scale parameter, the length of the arm here. And now the shape parameter will be the angle subtended by the 2 arms. So it goes from 0 to pi in principle. So then it would be, if this theta is 0, so you would have essentially a binary lens. And if it goes to pi, you will have, again, 3 points in a straight line. And if you do this, again, you do the same procedure. So you find something, substantially more complicated. So now, as a function of angle, you have a lot of different regions divided by these boundaries in the parameter space. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 different areas in parameter space. And in principle, now what you have to do is you look into each of the areas at what is the geometry of the critical curves and caustics, which is mapped down here. And you can stare at this for a while and try to see if all of these are different. And the quick answer is no, not all of these are different. Some of these are the same. So you can see here this E and J, these different regions, have 1 outer loop and 2 inner loops, and that's the same here. If you look at H and K, again, these two, so you have 1 outer loop and 4 inner loops, and the same is true here. And this final pair is this I and L region, where you have 1 outer loop and 3 inner loops. But apart from that, these others are each a different topology. So in the previous regime, you saw 6 different topologies or lens regimes. Here you see 9 different lens regimes. Now, let's return for a while to this pair of, this I and L case. And if we zoom in and take a look at the critical curve and at the caustic, so while the critical curve has the same general topology, 1 outer loop, 3 inner loops in both cases, the caustic looks dramatically different. Well, you have 2 small 3-cusp loops, but instead of the third small loop, here you have, 1 3-cusp loop, but here, instead of this loop, you have 1 loop with 4 cusps. And here, the outer loop has 4 cusps here, but in this case, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, and 3 more cusps here, 7 cusps. So even though if we, define to first division the lens regimes by the critical curve, so if you look at the caustic, you have something even more complicated. So in principle, you have to still study the number of cusps and how the number of cusps changes. And the reason is that you can have several caustic geometries, as illustrated here, which correspond to the same critical curve topology. You can study this, and this, of course, division by the changing number of cusps will introduce additional boundaries. So there will be all these boundaries plus additional boundaries in the parameter space. It can be done, and you can use even the Jacobian contour plots and find there what are the number of cusps. But I won't go into this today, so because I couldn't get to exomoons then, but I will refer you to these papers with Kamil Daněk from 2015, where we describe how to do this and what you get. Instead, let's look at something more general. So these were trivial combinations. We had, let's say 3 equal masses and some very specific configurations, in a straight line or in an isosceles triangle. So why not look at, let's fix the 3 masses and take a totally general spatial configuration. So if you look at this, so to define the geometry of a static triple lens, you have 5 parameters compared to the 2 parameters of the 2-point mass lens. 2 of these are relative masses. The third relative mass is, 1 minus the sum of these 2. And then there are 3 parameters which describe the spatial configuration. And the spatial configuration really, again, is a projected triangle. So to choose these parameters, it is reasonable to take one parameter which describes the size, and that will be something that will play the role of your scaling parameter. So we will choose something which is, democratic, or, which gives equal weight to all of the masses, and we shall choose the parameter, the outer length of the sum, the sides of the triangles summed together. And then we have 2 parameters which will define the shape of the triangle. And what we choose is we take 2 relative side lengths. Of course, The third side length, if you sum up the relative side lengths, so again, the sum of them gives 1. So you take, A plus B plus C divided by P. And if you have any 3 quantities which summed up together give you 1, so that is a hint that, to visualize this, and moreover, all of these are positive numbers. So it is reasonable to plot these in something that is called the ternary plot, and which is sketched here. So the ternary plot is a triangle. And along the 3 sides of the triangle, you have the 3 quantities which sum up to 1. So here you have 1 relative side length, 2nd relative side length, and 3rd relative side length. And here you have the lengths. Each of the side lengths can go from 0 to 1/2 of the total perimeter. Of course, you cannot have more than 1/2 of the perimeter for a triangle. And these lengths always go under 60 degrees angles. So you have here, let's say 4/12, 1/3 of the perimeter. So if the side A is 1/3, so there are these configurations. And similar from length B, let's say if it is 1/3 of the perimeter, so you have here, and side C, let's say 1/3 of the perimeter, you go here. So any point here defines the shape of a triangle, and all shapes of a triangle can be defined by picking a point in this plot. And again, within this plot, all of the components are have an equal weight and are democratically, graphically represented. So this is something which will be useful to identify the shape of a triangle. So a point in this gives you the shape, and to get the size, you have the perimeter. So to plot this, we use this ternary plot as a base of the triangle, and we erect above it, the vertical coordinate will be the perimeter. So in principle, you will get a prism shape. If you still look at this ternary plot, so if you go to the sides of the ternary plot, so here you have collinear combination. So that's when, so let's say this side corresponds to side B being equal to 1/2 of the perimeter. That means this thing is maximum and this body is somewhere in between 1 and 3. And the same goes for the other 2 sides. So these here, here, and here are collinear combinations. And if you go all the way to one of these one of the corners, where that means so there always one of the lengths of the sides is equal to 0. So that's when you have a degenerate combination and you have the 3 different binary combinations. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. So here you have the ternary plot down there, which gives you all different triangle shapes. And now you change from 0 perimeter, and you can go up to infinite perimeter in principle. So what I sketch here is, let's take one given shape of a triangular combination. So, A, B, C fractional is 0.25, 0.35, 0.4. So here you have these 3 positions of the lenses. And now for this, of course, you can compute, again, you compute the Jacobian saddle points, etc. And in principle, you get, and here you really get 6 different values at which the topology of the critical curve should change. So I denoted them here by these color little polygons, and the critical curve plotted here is for this red position. So if you are before the first transition, so in the closest regime, when the lenses are closest together. So you can see here you have an outer loop with 4 inner loops. So the first topology change, one of the inner loop connects with the outer loop. You can see parts of the caustic connect here. Next topology change, you have another loop which connects, another part of the caustic connects. You go higher to a larger separation. So that means here the perimeter is already 3 Einstein radii. And in fact, 3 already of the loops connected. So you have this one complicated caustic loop and this one extra loop. And finally, you can reach this point where all of them are connected and you have one single critical curve loop. And this whole complicated thing is one single caustic loop. Now, if you go further and put them still wider apart, so one of the lenses, in fact, detaches. So you have one loop and another loop here. So you can see the caustic again separates. And the final transition is that, again, even the other loop detaches and you have 3 independent lenses, and these caustics eventually shrink to points. Okay, so you can do this for any given point here. So 1 is done by this, and infinity more are to go. So you can do that with a sufficiently dense sampling. And what you get then is you get not only these little patches, but you get altogether surfaces which divide your parameter space of all different lens configurations by critical curve topology. So this is what you get. And this is what you get for a triple mass lens with 3 equal masses in an arbitrary spatial configuration. So the point selected on the base gives you the shape, and then you go vertically up and you find the 6 different positions or length of parameter at which the critical topology or the lens regime will change. And these surfaces are just colored by order from the lowest to the highest. So at any point, the first transition occurs at this purple surface, second at the blue, third at the cyan, fourth at the green, fifth at the orange, and sixth at the red surface here. And, oh, sorry. Okay, hopefully I'm back. And to understand the geometry better, it's just you can rotate this around to see what the shapes are. And you can see it's something, you know, fairly complicated, fairly interesting, but of course symmetric in this particular case. So what you have to do now is just the final step, and that means to say, so these different spaces in between all these, you know, planes that you have here, so what is the topology there? So you have to pick points in these different, all these different, you know, gaps between the areas, and, you know, look at what is the critical curve geometry. What is helpful in this case is that we know what happens on the side, because on this side you have exactly the collinear configuration we studied before of 3 equal masses. So you can recognize here on this side the boundaries that we described before already. Moreover, we can utilize also the isosceles configurations which occur not on the side but on the midplane going here. So you have all these different regions and you can identify the different critical curve topologies. To do the full thing, of course, you have to go in more detail, and we did this in the way that we took different surfaces of different parameter and cut this whole thing and looked at the different areas and identified the topologies. And this is the result that you get. You get, this is, if you cut at the lowest parameter, so the first cut here is 1.5, sort of close to here. The last cut is at parameter 6.71 or so, here high up here, denoted by this line. And this is the structure that you will see along the different cuts. And here they are colored really according to the shape of the critical curve that you would see with the parameters there. So you can see that when you are close to the, you know, base here, that means in the closed limit, you have not only this regime where you have, you know, 1 outer plus 4 inner, but you have also in specific points these things. You can have also 1 outer loop plus 3 inner loops. That occurs within these spikes. And as you go up higher, so gradually different regimes start appearing. So you have 1 loop with 2 inner loops, 1 loop with 1 inner loop that occurs here, here, or here. Then you have 1 loop in total that is in these pink areas. And here you start getting regimes which are similar to the asymptotic regimes. So you have essentially a closed binary plus a, you know, separate lens that appears in these cyan regions. Then you have, you know, intermediate binary and a separate lens in these magenta. Here you have 1 special configuration which occurs in very narrow regions where you have this configuration. And finally, this gray area, that's the 3 independent lenses regime, and that's in the middle of this of the surfaces up here. Here, what you do is, of course, these planes are just, you know, they can give you a false impression of the probability of these different configurations, which is just, you know, due to the geometry of the ternary plot. So if you really compute what the probabilities are as a function of parameter going from 0 to, you know, here 8 at the upper limit, so these patches give you the probability of the different of these different topologies occurring. So when you are closing, you have just these 2 topologies. Then you have different topologies kicking in, and then you reach the asymptotic topologies, which are these 4 topologies here. And you can study which one kicks in when, which one is the most probable, and so on. Just to put you back in perspective, so this whole map or so on, if you want to say what is the equivalent in the 2-point mass lens, so yeah, in the 2-point mass lens, that's equal to, you know, finding the regimes along this line. So this is the equal mass 2-point mass lens. So, you know, here we had just 2 different, you know, boundaries and 3 simple regimes. Here you have this whole complicated thing. So now what is left to do is you do this for all different mass combinations. And that's, of course, something, you know, the method how to do it is same as we did so far, but you have to do it for, you know, what specific combination of masses you like. So I'll just show here briefly the results for 2 other combinations. One is if you have an equal mass binary with a planet in, and then a system of a star with a planet with a moon. So the surfaces for a equal mass binary with a planet, which has a mass ratio 10 to the minus 4 of the total mass, is here. And you can see, I mean, some features are similar, like you have these, you know, 3 spikes going down where you have the 3 loops inside an outer loop, but the geometry of the outer loops is not totally the same, and you have a difference on which side you are in. So you can see that here on the front side, what you are changing here, if you move along the front side, is you are moving with this low mass planet along the connection of these 2 binary lenses. So, you know, not much changes there, but you have changes only if you are exactly here at the point where the binary lens of the 2 binaries is just separating. So if you put the point mass in between, or the, you know, planet in between, you will have dramatic changes. Of course, you can do the same. You can map the critical curve topologies from, you know, going from down to up. And you can do the same. I have just fewer sections here, going from, you know, 1 to here about 5.6 or so. The interesting thing is that in this case, you see all the topologies you saw before, but you see 2 additional topologies. This topology indicated by 10 here, this green one, and then there is this dashed topology 11. And both of these topologies have a critical curve where you have 1 loop inside a loop inside another loop, something that, you know, we didn't even think could exist until we found it. And it occurs in this particular region. You can find inside where this is. And this one occurs in such a small region that we didn't even mark it here, but it's also close to this particular case. The messages, the number of different regimes depends on the different masses that you put in the combination. So you don't get always the same range of regimes. Although, you know, many of them are the same, but you can have different regimes if you use different mass combinations. Again, you can compute the regimes, and you can see that this is the range of parameters where this type of critical curve appears. And here we just mark by dash curves where this other one appears. The final model is, as I promised, so here you have a star, here you have a planet, which has the mass of 10 to the minus 2 of the star, and a planet, which has the mass of 10 to the minus 4 of the star. So it's such a, you know, hierarchical combination of masses. But in fact, this thing can describe this combination of masses described by, you know, this full plot gives you arbitrary spatial configurations. So this could also describe a star with 2 planets of these different masses. But the regime where you are in the regime where this low mass thing, this moon, is close to the planet, is when A is small, and that is exactly this region of the parameter space. So this part of the parameter space, where you can see most of the structure, so this corresponds to the regime where you really have a star with a planet with a moon. And again, just to see what the surfaces really are 3-dimensionally, so you can, you know, look around and you can see, in, you know, from 2 sides it's fairly simple, but this is the regime where most of the, you know, transitions and different regimes occur. So that's in fact the most interesting regime of, you know, such a hierarchical lens. Here are the plots of the different topologies, and you can see again most of the action is in this corner where you really are in the regime of a star with a planet with a moon. And in the other regimes, you have just, different boundaries kicking in and sweeping across this ternary plot. So, the transitions in the rest are fairly simple. If you look at the topologies, you have the same topologies as in the previous case. So you have these 11 topologies. We didn't identify any other topology. Again, you can look at the probabilities, but let's look at the final thing I wanted to show, or, what I mentioned. What I showed so far was a static configuration for the triple lens, but of course, whether it be one planet and binary or two planets or a star with a planet with a moon, it's highly probable that during the course of the weeks or months of the microlensing event, you will have orbital motion. So of course the configuration can change, which means if you plot the position in the ternary in this parameter space, so the masses do not change, so you can use the same plot you had here, but of course the point corresponding to the particle configuration at a given time will be moving inside this plot. And I'm showing here a few examples. So let's say you have a binary with a planet. So you have, two equal mass star, and you have a planet around one of them. And here are the parameters. And we are looking at it not face on, but under an inclination of, 0.3 pi. So it's not exactly edge on, but it's, under an inclination. And if you plot in the ternary plot, if you look at the orbits, of course, the shape will be changing because the shape of the projected triangle will be changing. And of course, the size will be also changing. So if you look here, so it goes up and down, and it goes, this is the region which will be occupied by this system. And if you look at the region that it occupies in the parameter space of the lens and compare it with the surfaces, so you can see it's in this region and it occurs here. And you can see that in this particular case, during this entire orbit, it will just pass between two different regimes. It crosses this one surface. So, you know where to search for such a system. What if you have a circumbinary planet? So let's say you have an equal mass binary and a planet which is outside orbiting the center of mass of the binary, and now we are already close. Now what I'll be showing is already a nearly edge-on system, so you'll have fairly large changes in the perimeter of the projected triangle, so it can be fairly large or fairly small depending on the projected configuration. And this is the region that is occupied, and if you look at it here, so you can see that this is where you can reach during the orbit of the system. And if you look at it in more detail, so you'll see that in this particular case, you could reach, this region, and this region. So 3 different topologies can occur along this regime. The final promised regime is the star with the planet with the moon. So again, I have some model here where the, planet-moon separation is 10 times smaller than the planet-star separation, just for the model. And again, we are looking nearly edge-on for this configuration. So you will have, again, changes, quite dramatic changes in the configuration of the lens. And here I have it rotated a bit. So this is in my case, this is the part of the parameter space corresponding to the exomoon configuration. So you can see you'll have the points moving around in this region. The highest parameter will be here, lowest here. And if you include the plot here, so you can see that this, orbit will cross into nearly all of the regimes in this corner. So you can expect the highest diversity of changes in the critical curve and caustic in such events. Final slide with real content is, so what does this mean for detectability of exomoons? And what I use here are the results which were shown by Christine Liebig and Joachim Wamsgans in the 2010 paper. So what I showed so far is what's happening, what are the different lens regimes, what are the critical curves. Once you have the critical curves, you can look at the caustics, changes in cusps, and so on. And you can plot the caustics, plot the amplification maps, and that's exactly what you have here. So what you have here are cases. This is the configuration of a star and a planet, and you have a moon orbiting the planet, and this is the same star planet configuration, but you have the moon which is at different positions around the planet. So here it's under a different angle and a different angle. And you can see that in this particular case, and it is really selected so that you have, a really strong effect, the planet is 10 to the minus 3 of the, star mass, and the moon is 10 to the minus 5 of the mass of the star. So you can see that here, this feature is generated by the moon on the caustic of the, without this, it would be just a simple planet, but with this, it's a moon. And if you have a light curve where the source passes just behind this, this is the shape of the light curve you would see. Similar things are plotted here. Here you have this as the feature due to the moon, and here you have this as the feature due to the moon. And if you look at the light curves, so here, the moon feature causes there to be this peak here, which wouldn't be there if you didn't have the moon. In this case, well, the feature is fairly weaker, and really the feature is just a different shape of this peak. So this is not so great for detectability. And in this case, you can see there is this additional peak is due to the crossing of this part of the caustic. Now we have two curves which are plotted here. The solid curve is if the source star is a solar radius star. So it's a dwarf star essentially, which the size of the sun. And the dashed curve is if you have a larger star with the radius 3 times the solar radius. And if you have a larger star, so in fact you are averaging over a larger area of this amplification map, and all the peaks and features are gradually being suppressed and washed out. So you can see already here, there is some signal, but here you would be already, if you didn't have the planet there, so it probably would be fairly similar in both cases. Here you would notice nothing. And here you can see that even this peak is strongly suppressed if you have already a 3 solar radii star. And in principle, when you look at bulge stars, so many of the bulge source stars in the microlensing events are subgiant or giant stars. They are distant and bright. So if you would have, let's say, a 10 solar radius star, so you would be very hard pressed to see any feature due to the exomoon, even in this fairly optimistic scenario. Nevertheless, these are just the shapes of the light curves, but to see detectability, you have to compare them with the light curves of what would you get if you just fit a star with a single planet. And the comparison is here, not for one of these light curves, but for a light curve similar to this one, but where the source track would be just parallel to the main axis here. So it would go horizontally through this feature. So you can see it's symmetric. So this solid curve is the light curve with the moon, and the dashed curve is the same system, just you ignored the moon, so you don't have the moon there. So you can see the dashed curve looks different, and the deviation curve looks, you can see something fairly prominent where the deviation goes from, plus minus 0.3 magnitudes. That's not too bad. Of course, what you really have to compare is the best fit binary. So not just that you take the same binary and pluck out the planet, but you have to take the light curve and fit the best fit binary. And that's the case here. The best fit binary copies most of the features except this central peak. So really the deviation there is just this peak, which is still about 0.2, 0.3 magnitudes, which is not totally bad. But you can see the duration here is about 1/100th of the Einstein radius crossing time. Which brings us to some conclusions about the detectability. To detect an exomoon, you need a source star that is not a giant. So you need a dwarf star, ideally. Still, you need something sufficiently bright. So you need really accurate photometry. If you want a non-giant star, which is somewhere far away, and you want to have, precise photometry. What you need also is you need high cadence sampling of the light curves, because this is 1/100th of the Einstein radius. So if you have sparse sampling, you won't see this, or you'll get just one point here, which will be hard to detect from just a random Gaussian deviation. Ideally, you want to observe it by multiple telescopes to have confirmation of any feature. And ideally, of course, you want to have them space-based for all of the reasons above, to have accurate photometry, high cadence sampling, and multiple telescopes. And in a recent preprint by Etienne Bachelet et al., Etienne shows with his collaborators that if you look at the regime in which the Roman Space Telescope will be observing, which is the upcoming space telescope, which will have a dedicated microlensing survey. And if you have the Euclid telescope joining in also, where it is probably not yet decided if they'll be doing a microlensing survey or not, but if you have these two telescopes doing their survey, so it is realistic to expect the detection of exomoons probably in the single numbers. So, not any high number, but you should be able to detect exomoons. If you have only one of these, if you don't have the Euclid survey, the detectability doesn't drop by a lot, by, let's say, I don't know, 10% or so. But of course, you have the drawback of, not having a confirmation from another telescope. Of course, you can supplement these data by any Earth-based observatories. So, it is feasible, and we can expect and we need not be even overly optimistic to find some exomoon detections. If you look at this feature itself, 0.3, 0.2 magnitudes or so on, such things are easily detectable even from the ground. But of course, you would need these other things. You would need to have a non-giant source star and so on. So my last slide to put up the summary. The rate of detection and the rate of published Threebody events is increasing, partly because of the pipelines, the photometric pipelines are so on, have improved in all the surveys and all the follow-up projects, and partly also that people got used to analyzing and sampling the rich Threebody lens parameter space. Analysis of any of these events will be greatly aided by a deeper understanding of the Threebody lensing, so that you don't miss any local maxima, which can prove to be the real solution for any of these systems. The full range of the lens regimes can be mapped in the lens parameter space, as I just showed, and the full range of the regimes depends on what is the specific combination of the masses that you use. We detected 11 different lens regimes, which means regimes defined by the critical curve topology. If we look just at the exomoons, which is sort of one of the most attractive prospects of what you can detect by Threebody lensing, the upcoming space-based surveys are quite likely and may lead to exomoon detection. So let's hope the surveys go operating. Let's hope even Euclid joins, and let's see what will come in the following years. What I was talking about, most of the things that I mentioned can be found in these 3 articles we published with Kamil. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. That was really very thorough and very amusing, I would say. We are quite short in time, so I'll allow.
I'm very sorry, I didn't watch my clock properly.
Right, that's fine. I will allow for just one question, and I'm sure Radek has one. Please come forward.
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot, David.
Hi, Radek.
Great stuff. So the question.
The camera.
Oh, the camera. Hi. So the question I have is if any of the configurations for triple lines is your favorite when it comes to the topology or critical curve topology. Do you have a favorite one?
Well, I mean, of course, the favorite ones, in a sense, are these which we discovered, which we didn't even think they could exist. That means this loop in a loop in a loop. So that's, quite peculiar. And in fact, you can see that in the equal mass lens and probably in similar things like, probably triple star events, this is something you probably wouldn't detect. And what is really nice about this particular thing, this, loop in a loop in a loop is, that's something you couldn't get just by randomly sampling the parameter space, because, what is the probability of hitting that particular little spot there? But you can find this analytically and by just, understanding what are the properties of lensing. And that is, in fact, how Kamil also, identified that this is not a fluke, but that it's real. What you take is you take the 2-point mass lens in the closed regime. So there you have one outer loop and 2 inner loops. And the 2 inner loops have the Jacobian positive inside. So now if you take a low mass body and plug it inside these regions, So obviously, close to any lens, the Jacobian is negative. So if this is a sufficiently low mass lens, so this will introduce an additional loop inside the loop before. So, this is one of the favorite regimes because you can even explain why it should appear and then find that it appears. But other than that, always the favorite is the one which we haven't detected yet. So, and to maybe add one last sentence to this, I said we detected 11 regimes so far. What is the total number of lens regimes? We don't have a mathematically proved final answer yet because we would have to really sample all different mass combinations. But we have been looking at topological arguments of what different critical regime transitions there can be if you look just at the shapes of critical curves and keep changing the parameters. And there are topological arguments which you can use. And if some of, mathematical properties of these loops, which we suspect are real, so then we can really prove that this is all, that you have just these 11 regimes, but we don't have this one final little step. So it's possible these are all, but we haven't just exactly proved it yet. So that's a long answer to a short question, sorry.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. Let's thank our speaker again. I hope we stay in touch and continue the collaboration.
I will stay in touch, and of course, any questions you have, send to me by email or get in touch with me or with Kamil. We'll be happy to answer. And we'll be happy, of course, for any further collaboration because there is a lot more interesting stuff to come. So thank you all for your patience and attention.